This episode of Moving Panels is brought to you by... In a world filled with uncertainty and confusion, where the lines between truth and lies blur like shadows in the night, it's easy to feel lost, adrift in a sea of chaos. But now there's hope. Introducing Rorschach, the prescription for a world gone mad. Our unique formula is designed to restore clarity and confidence, helping you navigate the complexities of modern life with ease. With Rorschach, you'll feel empowered to confront the harsh realities of the world, knowing that you hold the key to your own truth. When the world cries out for salvation, they'll look up and shout, "Save us," and you'll whisper, "No." Because with Rorschach, you'll have the strength to stand tall in the face of adversity. Side effects may include heightened awareness of societal hypocrisies, increased skepticism towards authority figures, and occasional existential dread. Use caution when confronting inconvenient truths and avoid prolonged exposure to moral ambiguity. In rare cases, prolonged use may lead to an overwhelming sense of isolation and detachment from society. If symptoms persist or worsen, consult your doctor or vigilante psychologist immediately. Take control of your reality. Ask your doctor about Rorschach today. Welcome to this Moving Panels One Shot. Let's have a nerdy little conversation, and it is March Madness for us, and we are talking Watchmen, going in deep, and I do mean deep, because there is so much to Watchmen, and we are starting right here with the origin story of how the Watchmen came to be. And so with me today, I've got two of my usual co-hosts. First off, the man that is all the way up in Alaska. Please welcome Chad Smith.
How's it going, Laramy? Thanks for having me again. These are always fun.
Oh, it's always a blast. And then along with him, we've got the dapper Southern gent. It's Blake Fowler.
I guess really couldn't be further apart, Chad and myself, both in physical location and looks, as Chad is very dapper himself. So, no, just happy to be here. And I'm ready to answer the question of who watches The Watchmen, Laramy.
You know what? I should have written down the Latin phrase that is supposedly
I can't remember
came from.
Either,
yeah, it's "who guards the guards" is what I know it translates to.
Well, in basketball, it's typically the other guards that guard them, but I don't know about anything else. I'm ready to learn about Watchmen, just like everybody else. I've watched the movie, read the comic, but I'm interested to hear the origins here.
All right, well, let's get into it. I did want to talk a little bit about Alan Moore. Of course, we've been talking about Alan Moore, it seems like, for a whole year now.
It's pretty fascinating, man. I mean...
Yeah, but Alan Moore was born November 18th, 1953 in Northampton, England. And I discovered in this research on Watchmen, he learned how to read by the age of 5. So, pretty impressive.
Yeah.
My
Nice.
5-year-old is currently in the reading, so... But it led to him getting into comic books at the age of 7. Now, what is fascinating about this is the way he got comic books. Have either one of you, and I'm kind of betting Chad have either one of you ever heard of Ballast Comics? And know what a Ballast comic, this isn't a company, what a Ballast comic is?
I mean, I know what a ballast is, but does that have anything to do with an actual ballast?
It does.
So, yeah, enlighten me.
Yeah, so apparently back in the 50s, because we had just come out of World War II, so metal was extremely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Ships would make their ballasts out of paper, and that included old, unsold comic books.
Okay.
So the companies actually used this as kind of a way to cheat the system. So the idea was that when they couldn't sell comics, the company, instead of them returning them to the company would say, well, just rip off like half of the cover, just send us those to prove you destroyed it. But that didn't stop people from buying them. And then there were others, they would sell them to the shipping companies to use as the ballast. So they're making profit off of these. The company is reimbursing them for the unsold comics, and then they're selling the unsold comics either
probably writing them off on taxes
people
too.
Or
it's a loss, so.
Yeah. So they would be the actual ballast of the ship. For those of you who don't know, that's the weight in the ship that kind of helps it keep it balanced. And what would happen is let's say they'd leave from East Coast of America. the ship would travel all the way to United Kingdom. As soon as it arrived, they would then dispose of the ballast.
Didn't need it anymore.
And people started to go and collect them up off the shore, and then they sold them. And so that is how Alan Moore got introduced to comics, was by reading these, water destroyed, but I guess dried them out. To me, I'm like, the pages would stick together. I don't know how it all worked, but that is how, and I found that fascinating.
No, that is.
Yeah, it's like, use what you've got access to.
Yeah. No,
yeah. According to Alan Moore, at least to his best recollection, the first comic his mother got for him was actually a Fantastic Four comic. It is believed it was Fantastic Four number 3, based off of the way he described the story. So that was pretty cool. But
that makes sense. He has many times said that like his hero in comic writing is Jack Kirby. So like
and Steve Ditko, which is we're going to talk a lot about with Watchmen.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense that would have been his first introduction, or at least the first thing he remembered would be a Fantastic Four comic. So
yeah, and then he also discovered Charlton Comics, which we're going to get into very deep because they are a huge connection to the origin. But I wanted to really quick, since I'm talking about Alan Moore and the way he got into comics, I wanted to talk about Dave Gibbons, the co-creator and illustrator. He was born April 14th, 1949, so a little older than Alan Moore. And he was born right outside of London. And he was actually working as a surveyor in 1973 when he saw a psychedelic advertisement for a fantasy bookstore. And he could draw. He was already an artist, but that really inspired him to get into comic drawing. It wasn't until later in life that he then found out that advertisement was drawn by Alan Moore.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah. That's awesome.
I heard that
serendipitous.
Yeah. So I thought that was an awesome connection. Of course, the two worked together before Watchmen. They worked on a British comic magazine called 2000 AD back in the 70s. And so Watchmen wasn't their first team up, and it wouldn't be their last, because me as a Superman fan, I also know they are behind the For the Man Who Has Everything Superman storyline that also came out in the 80s. So there you have it. But let's get into the actual origins of Watchmen. So Blake, because Chad's already kind of responded to this, do you know what Charlton Comics is? Have you ever heard of Charlton Comics?
Only in the vaguest sense of Charlton Comics. So I'm not even going to attempt to discuss it, and let you just, again, take the lead here and tell me all about it.
So Charlton Comics was a publishing company that was based out of Connecticut that started up in the 40s, right at the boom.
I think they were a publishing company that started in the 40s up in Connecticut, is what I've heard.
I mean, when you tell me Connecticut, I automatically think 1940s comic books. I mean, that's
absolutely
given, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The absolute heart of comic books as we know it.
Look, we're not going to get into this because, again, there's so much to this background and all. But apparently Charlton Comics had a tie to the mafia. And so, I mean, seriously.
You can look Connecticut?
Into this stuff. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's crazy. But Charlton Comics, for those of you who have ever heard of characters like Blue Beetle and The Question and Peacemaker, they all came from Charlton Comics. They were not DC original characters. We, of course, now know them as DC characters. And that is because DC acquired all of Charlton Comics in the early 80s. So this was right before Watchmen came out. But you had their main characters were Blue Beetle, you had Captain Atom, The Question, Peacemaker, Nightshade, female character, and Thunderbolt. And we're going to talk about in detail, these were the characters that inspired The Watchmen. Now, some of these characters you have, like I said, you have heard about them. DC not only bought the characters, but then they integrated them into the main DC universe during Crisis on Infinite Earths. But Alan Moore, of course, was working with DC. He had huge success with Saga of the Swamp Thing, where he took a character who had kind of floundered and just revamped That character drastically went from a man who thought he was a plant to a plant who thought he was a man.
Yeah.
Changed the
Not
whole story.
a plant, a
of
swamp.
Thing.
Yeah,
And,
the swamp.
Like
Yes.
weird, like
An
cosmic
ecosystem.
swamp entity
Yeah.
that was conned into thinking he was a man. Yeah. It was pretty brilliant.
But the DC decided they wanted to give Moore his own story, and Moore knew exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to do a murder mystery. He originally had the idea back in the 60s when he was reading Archie Comics, and there was a group of characters in Archie Comics called the Mighty Crusaders, and he originally had the idea of taking one of their main characters called the Shield, who was kind of a Captain America ripoff, and doing a murder mystery surrounding his death. So the death of the Shield.
Just pause for a second. Only Alan Moore could read Archie Comics and think to himself, dark murder mystery.
Murder mystery.
Yeah.
I was just sitting here thinking, Chad, like, have I been reading the wrong Archie Comics all my life?
I mean, I'm just saying, that sets the scene for the rest of this conversation. Like,
jeez.
Oh yeah. Well, because as soon as DC gave him this idea, he went, well, hey, y'all just acquired these Charlton characters. You know, they were like, okay, well, you can use them. So he changed it and he wrote the story. So when he first wrote the story, he wrote it called "Who Killed Peacemaker."
Yeah. So
the original idea was to be about the death of Peacemaker, and then superheroes having to figure out, you know, this murder mystery essentially.
So I actually read this a little bit differently. Like, I'm not disagreeing with you, and we all know that, you know, there's 72 different stories on how all of this happens for every comic book. But Alan Moore was interested at first in using a now long defunct and nobody remembers comic book, MLJ, I think it was the comic.
That was the Archie. That was the Mighty Crusader.
So it was actually Gibbons, who was buddies with some of the guys at Charlton, who was like, you should use these characters. And he had already written Who Killed the Peacemaker before it became a DC pitch. And then it timed really badly. It was like right when DC was buying Charlton. And they're like, yeah, we kind of just bought those guys. We'd love it if you didn't kill them. Like,
yeah.
You know, so
once they knew Moore's plan, they went, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't use the Charlton characters because
we'd like some ROI.
We won't be able to use
guys.
them. Yeah, I mean, you're starting your story killing one of them. Like, we can't use that character now. So yeah, no, that's about what I heard. I wasn't sure that he wrote it before the Charlton deal, but yeah, he wrote the Who Killed the Peacemaker. But ultimately, their plan, Moore and Gibbons' plan, was they wanted to set the story in the quote unquote real world.
Yeah.
They didn't want the hyper realistic world that most DC characters existed in. And there's nothing more real than saying, you know what? Let's make it so Nixon was still president.
That screams reality. Yes.
The thing was that Moore actually felt that no one would get upset about anything that he said about the government if Nixon was the president.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
That tracks.
And considering later in interviews well after Watchmen was out, he's been quoted as saying that it wasn't an anti-American piece because it gets criticized as anti-American.
Yeah.
He says blatantly, no, it's anti-Reaganism. Yeah. And Nixonism is like Reaganism 1.0, so like the whole thing tracks pretty well. You're like, he's sitting there going, I can make fun of Nixon as your placeholder for Reagan, but
people will let me get away with it because it's Nixon. Yeah, I did find that he was also they were also inspired by Mad Magazine with a story titled Super Duper Man, which pretty much subverted the superhero comics, which is obviously what Watchmen is famous for. And so Moore wanted to do that. Of course, Mad Magazine does it in a comedic way. Moore says, I'm going to do that in a more serious tone.
Yeah.
Go a little darker with it. Not
That is
really
a
have
way
the
to
comedy.
say it. Yeah.
Darker, soul-sucking,
Yeah.
whatever, you know.
Yeah. Straight
Yeah.
depression.
But as we've stated, DC didn't want him using the Charlton characters after they knew what his plan was. So they said, well, why don't you create original characters? And Moore was not a fan of that because he knew that there would be no interest in original characters. But the more he and Gibbons thought about it, they went, okay, these Charlton characters are more stereotypical. And so if I just take these concepts,
Yeah, the archetype.
these ideas, then I can create something that's familiar to the reader.
Yeah.
And then kill them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go into what, and Chad can, of course, step in with the research that maybe he's done of where some of these characters came from. And I'll start off with Ozymandias. Ozymandias is probably the most direct copy. He is a copy of the Charlton character Thunderbolt. And now, let me make it clear. Very similar to the Watchmen, most Charlton comic characters did not have superpowers. There was just the one that was Captain Atom. There were a couple that kind of had like magical powers that I'll get into with one. But yes, Thunderbolt was just a regular guy. He was an orphan who was trained by monks. So kind of a little bit of a Batman similarity there.
Let you have it.
And he makes his body reach its physical peak ability. So there's another similarity with Ozymandias. He is given the scrolls of knowledge, which he studies to making his intellect advanced. And so very similar to the way Ozymandias is portrayed, like the way he catches the bullet and the way he moves and all that. Thunderbolt was a regular human guy who was just so skilled at everything that it appeared as superpowers. So he was just a highly advanced human, I guess you would say.
Or colorful Batman, as the rest of us like to say. So
Sure, yeah. Sounds like it's stealing Batman's whole gambit right there. So
Look, there's a lot of these characters that steal a little bit from Batman.
So good, he just appeared to be a super. So that's like me eating anything sugary. I can eat so much of it, it just appears as a superpower. It's not actually a superpower. 12 donuts is nothing. That's all.
Yeah, why not? Then we move on to Dr. Manhattan. Most people will connect him to Captain Atom, the Charlton character, who later became a DC character, who was a character created by the great Steve Ditko.
Mm-hmm. Most of these guys were.
Most of these were. Yeah, characters that Stan Lee couldn't take credit for. So you got Captain Atom, who was, again, actual superpower. He was a man who gained his powers from being in they put him in a spaceship. He gets shot into space. It's Fantastic Four. It gets bombarded with radiation.
It's like, are you sure this is not the Thing?
No.
Yeah.
And then just like Dr. Manhattan, after the explosion, he rematerializes on the ground.
And joins the Blue Man group.
Well, he's not blue.
Oh, okay. All right.
No, we haven't got there.
He looked like just a traditional superhero guy.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't until DC would take hold of him that he would have kind of the silver.
Yeah, there it is.
More look. But I also found that even before Captain Atom, there's another character called Atom Man, who I found out was the inspiration for Captain Atom. And the connection here is that Atom Man was a scientist who was working on a top secret experiment for the government dealing with radioactivity, and that was the incident that gave him. So just like Dr. Manhattan or the Hulk, we could go that route as well. So
6 of 1, really.
I mean, in 1950, you have two origin stories. You can get bitten by something radioactive, or you can get radioactive space matter while you're exploring the stars. Like, that's the way it happens. So what are you going to do?
Every kid's dream to be bitten by a radioactive animal.
All
just
radiation.
Long, yeah.
That's the only thing that creates superheroes is radiation. Because we know nothing bad comes from radiation. I mean, only superpowers happen. So
Can your parents be alive and this still happen, or they both have
that's
to
what
be
I'm saying. Yeah,
deceased also?
You got to be an orphan
There's
as well.
There's a lot of things that have to occur.
Which I do want to point out that they pay homage to Charlton Comics. The orphanage that Rorschach is from is named the Lillian Charlton Home for Problem Children.
I know that. That's cool.
Nice.
For problem children.
So
problem children.
Wow.
yeah, and then when Tom King did the
Oh god, let's
future Watchmen stuff.
Yeah, let's don't.
Which we're not going to get into,
Yeah.
but he made Charlton Comics the comic publisher within the Watchmen universe.
Interesting.
So whereas in Alan Moore's Tales of the Black Freighter is a DC comic, in Tom King's version, comics are Charlton Comics. But yeah, the Rorschach series that Tom King did.
Was that Doomsday Clock that he did, or was that just?
I think it was just. I honestly think it was just called
the
Rorschach.
Yeah, it's just called Rorschach.
I think,
yeah.
All right, moving on to Silk Spectre. So Silk Spectre, probably one of the ones that's very loose. Really, I hate to say it, but Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons really just wanted to create the typical female character.
Femme fatale,
Yeah. They did say that she was based off of Nightshade from the Charlton Comics. The only thing is Nightshade actually had some powers, like she could turn into like a shadow. But there is a connection. So in the Charlton Comics, Nightshade had been Captain Atom's love interest. Same way they made Silk Spectre Dr. Manhattan's love interest. But other than that, there's really no other connection. I mean, the costumes don't even look the same. I did find where some people believe that the look of Silk Spectre is more based off of an old comic character called the Phantom Lady, who was in a bright yellow costume.
So
not very phantomy, but sorry, go ahead, Chad.
No, I was just going to comment on, for people who were, legitimately very creative, putting out visual stuff all the time, they could be pretty bad at naming things.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Let's go back to Batman for a second. So the idea of Batman is pretty groundbreaking. I mean, if no one had told you, hey, there's a dude that's going to dress up like a bat and like has this whole psychosis about bats, like the whole thing, you go, wow, that's pretty creative. Where'd you come up with that? And and then you go, well, what do you call him? Well, he's Batman.
Batman.
That's the best you could do. Like, I feel like that's the way with all these. Captain Atom, what does he do? He can control atoms. Okay.
What? Who controls things? Captains. That's her.
It's just like
the crazy thing is I'm pretty sure that in Charlton Comics, the man who becomes Captain Atom was already named Atom.
Oh, they just gave him.
And was like a captain in the Air Force.
Yeah.
Like,
Change the lettering. Change
Yeah. Because that's always funny to me. It's like, still sticking with Batman, the fact that a guy named Edward Nygma becomes the Riddler.
Right.
Hey, sometimes we're fated to our destinies, okay?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So back to Silk Spectre, there's also a loose connection to a DC character, Black Canary. So at the time, she was one of the big female characters, more street level than, characters like Wonder Woman. And then there's also the connection here where the original Black Canary, when she retires, it's her daughter who takes over the mantle. Right. So that same connection that you have within the comics. All right, next up, we've got the Comedian. Of course, this one kind of seems obvious. If the original story was called Who Killed Peacemaker, and then when you got to the Watchmen, the Comedian's the one who is killed. Of course, Peacemaker is believed to be the inspiration. Of course, Peacemaker in the comics, back in the Charlton Comics, had the famous quote, "I love peace so much, I'll fight for it." Of course,
such a great line.
Yeah.
I feel like Comedian is that famous Star Trek episode where Kirk has to like fight their evil nemesis from a different universe. And, you can tell that they're evil because they have facial hair. I feel like that's the comedian, like to Peacemaker. You know what I mean? Like,
and the thing is, he is almost an evil version of the Charlton Peacemaker.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, because the Charlton Peacemaker was quote unquote non-violent. Now, of course, he would fight.
Yeah.
But he did not carry lethal weapons. He had non-lethal weapons. But the similarity, of course, was that their tunnel vision on, this is how I maintain peace.
Yeah. Whereas comedian is a legit war criminal. And
murderer.
He's
actual murderer.
Yeah. I mean, not a good dude.
And then of course I find it funny that DC then took the character of Peacemaker and kind of went more towards the comedian.
the war criminal path.
So it kind of balanced out there.
Which one
it
sells
was more
books,
like
guys?
Peacemaker inspired comedian who then inspired Peacemaker.
Yeah.
So
this is an episode of Inception.
And Alan Moore's Nightmare. So
I also mentioned that originally he got the idea thinking about the character called the Shield, and so that's where it's believed the flag look on his shoulder pads.
Yeah,
it kind of comes from. Also, the Shield worked for the government on special ops, not the same kind of special ops the comedian was working on, but kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Moore has even said in an interview that the comedian was inspired by Sergeant Nick Fury.
Yeah.
So, which makes sense of the look.
Yeah, I mean the whole cigar chopping, even the gray
and the
hair,
white and the gray hair. Then next we've got Night Owl, who is just Blue Beetle and Batman if they had a baby.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of Chad's naming theme again. It's like, well, what is this? An owl? When does he come out? At night? Isn't
that kind of implied? Like, aren't owls nocturnal to begin with? So it's even like a bad, double.
Yeah.
It's just
like an oxymoron.
Yeah. Just
call him.
Sorry, guys.
Just call him owl to the rescue.
Or the owl,
the owl would have been fine.
Oh man.
They gave an origin to the name in a special feature they made of Hollis talking about his Under the Hood book.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
They asked him where the name Night Owl came from, and he said it was from one of the other cops who noticed how he was always working at night, and so he was a night owl. And
yeah,
that's where
never have understood that because it's redundant. Owls are already nighttime creatures, but neither here nor there, I suppose. Radioactive owl, I'm assuming, helped him get his powers.
Yeah, he was bitten by a radioactive owl.
Radioactive owl.
No, because then he'd be Owlman.
Oh, wait, sorry. Geez, sorry. Yeah. So many.
Come on.
So many raptors and birds of prey that we've got going on here.
But of course, from Charlton Comics, you got Blue Beetle. Of course, this was the Ted Kord version of Blue Beetle, which Steve Ditko created. And I mean, that's obvious with the gadgets and even the ship looking almost identical to Blue Beetle ship.
Just put owl eyes on it.
You've got that.
The big giant.
Yeah. Of course, you would connect that more to Hollis Mason's Night Owl. Daniel's Night Owl, the second one, is more Batman-like in terms of his look.
Yeah.
He has the lair underneath his house. He
should have been in a tree. Sorry.
Yeah, he's got the gadgets. Even though Night Owl is more Blue Beetle, you can't help but say he's Batman.
Why wouldn't you model yourself after the best? I'm not even mad at it.
He is like middle class Batman though. So
yeah, he's like Wish.com Batman.
Oh yeah.
Temu Batman.
Batman from Temu. Yeah.
Which I just learned how to pronounce, by the way.
Yeah, this is post Super Bowl, so we all know to pronounce it Temu.
Also, how much money do you have to get like 6 Super Bowl spots? I saw that commercial more than any other on the Super Bowl. Too much money for Temu. All thanks to my wife, mostly.
Well, I mean, honestly, it's the same thing with. I mean, you're talking about Night Owl. Like he's just a regular dude.
Yeah, just a guy.
How's he keeping up with all this?
grants and other funding.
Yeah. And then finally we have Rorschach, who most people would say it seems obvious he's based off the Question.
Mhm.
I mean, he almost looks identical to the Question, just with the Rorschach blob on his face instead of a blank face. Yeah. However, there is a character pre the Question called Mr. A, who was a Steve Ditko character that seemed to be one of his favorites. And Mr. A was a character who saw the rules in absolutes. So just like Rorschach does. He was very black and white. The comic was even in black and white. So connects again with that black and white of the Rorschach test and all that. So Rorschach, of course, many people connect with Rorschach if they connect with any character of the Watchmen in terms of who's your favorite Watchman. Most people say Rorschach. That was completely not Alan Moore's plan.
Yeah, but
Alan Moore...
I would almost argue that that's just human nature, because he is the one through whom you view most of Watchmen.
Yeah,
true.
He's the narrator.
He's the narrator.
Yeah,
so
you've
got,
in essence,
you are going to identify with him because you are viewing the story from his perspective. But he is Alan Moore's worst nightmare. He's a neocon.
Oh yeah.
That Alan Moore was extremely against. He's always been fairly progressive, and he wanted to paint Rorschach's conservatism as a blight on humanity. So
I like the use of a paint there with Rorschach. So that was good. No, and he's easily, whether you want him to be or not, the most recognizable. So before coming on here, I was talking to my wife about what we were recording. I told her we were going to talk about the Watchmen, and she immediately goes, "Oh, are you going to talk about Inkblot Man?"
Yeah.
And so that's she knows who Rorschach is without ever having seen it, and that speaks to I guess again, maybe not the popularity of Rorschach, but at least the knowability of who Rorschach is for everybody.
Yeah. Well, and Moore, going back to Batman, Moore said that he is probably more connected to Batman than he is to the Question. The idea was, again, Moore was talking about what if a person actually decided to do this. Again, he was trying to keep it reality based. And so Moore thought that Batman would be more, mentally unstable.
Agreed.
And that, his focus would be solely on getting the bad guys, and that a real life Batman would not care about his appearance, would not care about, being seen with women, would not have any interest in any. So Bruce Wayne wouldn't exist if a person actually had the mentality to be Batman. And so that was his thought behind creating Rorschach, which makes sense because you have that tie-in with what's the one thing Rorschach carries? A grappling gun.
Yeah.
So, an amazing grappling gun, I just want to point out, for how high up the comedian's apartment is. But yeah, he has the grappling gun.
Yeah, I think it's funny to me that people talk about The Boys as if it's, uber groundbreaking, because I'm like, Alan Moore did this 40 years
already.
It's
several times.
And that's not a knock on The Boys. It's a great property. And I think they do it, they obviously do it a little bit differently and a little more blatantly. But I think Alan Moore, specifically, I don't think this was something that came later where people started viewing it and were like, oh man, I think he's trying to say these things. I think Alan Moore wrote the story going, what would it be like if these psychopaths were real? And so, clearly he's showing you through the comedian, a guy who, he's not in real life invincible, but he kind of thinks he is. He thinks he can live through anything and that he can get away with anything. Mm-hmm. And so this is how he acts. He's a war criminal, psychopath, rapist. And then, you get to Rorschach. What does it look like for somebody to be so singularly focused on ending crime? Well, they would be pretty terrible to be at a party with.
Yeah.
But anyways, I just think that's funny. The whole, like, oh, The Boys is so thought-provoking and new and interesting. Like, yeah, Alan Moore was already doing that.
And The Boys focus too much on the superpower aspect of it, as well. You know,
and the how can we gross you out using it aspect.
Yeah.
So.
Oh,
yeah. And more like I said, looking for more of the what effect would this have on a regular person. Because even with Dr. Manhattan, the idea is even not only what does a super godlike person, how do they affect people, but also how does a person who in essence is a human being, because there are moments, and we'll talk about this more as we break down the movie as well next week, but there are moments in the comic and in the story where Dr. Manhattan has human moments.
Mm-hmm.
He breaks it down a lot. But what were your thoughts on his idea? We've already talked about this a little bit, but his idea to kind of have, I don't think he had that strong of a political statement, but he clearly, as we've talked about with V for Vendetta, clearly he had some political thoughts as he was writing this story.
I mean, maybe he's doing exactly what you're talking about fans kind of do. We all have heard writers do that, and I think kind of build on an idea that maybe was subconscious, and then after the fact they're like, yeah, I wrote it to say these things. But just to take him at face value, I would kind of push back a little bit against you saying that it's not that political, because Alan Moore seems to think it is. And again, like whether that's an evolution over time or not, I don't know. But he frames it as if he wrote it intentionally, saying Reagan fanatics in the U.S. are going to destroy the world. He really thought that Reagan's brand of bringing down the USSR was going to lead to nuclear war and kill everybody. And so I think he had a very nihilistic view that then also kind of fed on his personal politics. And I think that's very much part of this book. Again, like that could be him building it, from something that was maybe small to begin with, but I tend to believe him on this one and think that it was a driving factor all along.
Yeah, just very briefly piggybacking on that, it seems like his political beliefs seep throughout his works a lot of times, especially here.
Yeah.
And I don't see how we could read this and navigate our way through it without also looking at it through his lens. I mean, he's writing this, again, it feels like, not to use V for Vendetta, but not as a personal vendetta against Reaganomics and what he felt it was doing or did to the world. So, I think this is solely his view. And like Chad said, maybe that's evolved over time for him, that at first he wasn't willing to say, oh, this is exactly how I feel. Yeah. But as other people have come to it and have read it and have seen the same kind of things, perhaps he's like, okay, yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. I'm glad you get the point.
Yeah.
Which that leads to the evolution. That's what leads me to the last thing we're going to talk about is how the story, how Watchmen, because you've already talked about The Boys, but how this impacted the world of comics.
Oh, man.
I mean, you've got the connection with The Boys. I can't help but see how the Keen Act, which was to end, the superheroes' vigilante, the ability to do what they did, doesn't tie into what Marvel would later do with Civil War.
Yeah.
So just speak on what your impact you think that this, because people absolutely think that this was a turning point in comics when Watchmen came out.
I mean, 100%. You'd had a couple of works that lead up to this. Ironically, Swamp Thing is one of them. So Alan Moore had already kind of started this wheel rolling. But it sounds cliche and maybe, overblowing the work or whatever, but its importance. But there's no portion of comic book, whatever you want to call it, like its entirety, that this work does not change. I mean, everything from the dark grittiness of it, the realism.
Would we have Frank Miller
It
wasn't for the Watchmen?
It changed. I mean, down to the 9-panel format that had been the classic up until this work. And, him and Gibbons just throw that out and really elasticize entire panels and change the way that comic book flow, literally read. It changed everything about comics. It's
even the covers,
the use of recurring imagery that has become so important in comic books. You can almost label Watchmen as the end of the Bronze Age stagnation. It almost single-handedly kind of wipes that slate clean, where everything was just looking back, kind of sort of wishing it could be in the Silver Age again. And
rose-colored glasses a lot.
Yeah, man. So it's a benchmark work by any standard. Whether you like it or not is irrelevant to that part of the conversation. It changed everything.
Yep. It leads into, and again, I came to comics later in life, but going back and rereading, you've got some of the stuff in the early 90s, which I think is dark and gritty solely because of what they were able to do with Watchmen. I mean, you've got a run in the early 90s Batman comics where he's breaking up a child sex trafficking ring. Yeah. And I don't think you see that unless you get the Watchmen and all of the scummy things, so to speak, that come with it.
We spent a month fanboying pretty hard on the death of Superman. I would argue that the death of Superman could not have happened had Watchmen not preceded it. I honestly don't think it could have.
I agree.
Yeah, I could see an argument for that. And like you said, just the thinking about the way that they changed the way comics were made. I mentioned I can't help but focus on the covers, because he had Watchmen going, on the side instead of at the top, which I know that DC was even iffy about, because they were like, but that's not how you can't display it.
No one's going to see the title.
Yeah. But Dave Gibbons' artwork, pretty much the cover was the first panel of the comic.
Yeah.
Yeah. A big splash page.
Yeah. And then to see that, we're connecting it to things that came later. To me, Neil Gaiman then with Sandman does almost a similar thing. He breaks the rules of the way a comic is supposed to look. Even Beth and I just talked about Stardust, presenting essentially a novel, but as a comic book. Just stuff like that. Again, Frank Miller stuff. I don't think you get that anti-hero that would then become so big in the 90s.
Yeah.
McFarlane's Spider-Man.
I was just thinking McFarlane. Yeah.
Oh yeah, all the Image stuff.
He's very much influenced by Alan Moore throughout his career.
Oh, absolutely.
100%.
All right, so we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. This is the beginning of our March Madness. There's just so much. There's so much to talk about with Watchmen that we had to do a one-shot just to get all this background information out of the way. Next week, we'll come back and do the movie, the Zack Snyder 2009 Watchmen movie, that I'm very curious. We're not going to say anything right now, but I'm very curious as to what side my co-hosts are on, because it is a very polarizing movie. So we'll see where that goes. Then we're going to take another one shot to talk about the Tales of the Black Freighter, the comic within a comic that occurs, and what was Moore's and Gibbons' idea behind that. What was the reason for it? Some people don't know why it's in there, how it connects to the story. We'll get into a little bit of depth with that. And then Tim Williams is going to join me to talk about the 2019 HBO series of Watchmen. That is a sequel to the comic book, not a sequel to the movie, but a sequel to the comic book. And we will talk about how that furthered this story. And you know what? We might talk about a little bit more as to how Watchmen has been brought back a little bit in the DC world. But we'll save that for another one. We'll go ahead and end this one shot. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on this one. This is going to be a fun month.
And in-depth month as well.
All right, thanks everybody for listening. For Moving Panels, I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.